Thank you all for coming, all of you, to this third session of this Physis Summer School 2019. Today we are going to keep talking about combinatorial possibility. Peter who is going to talk about expounding and modifying Armstrong combinatorial theory.
Thanks, Javier. Yesterday we spent quite a lot of time discussing negative states and affairs and absences, and I see some of our students making a point in that regard. Some people aren't here. Oh well. And thanks everyone who spent hours trying to help me contact my wife. For some reason it spontaneously worked this morning. Now let me begin. In the previous lecture, I rejected theories of possible worlds. It's a bit dull in a way, going through various theories, saying what you think's wrong with them. And theories of complex propositions and structural universals. I reached the conclusion, provisionally I suppose, at that stage, that we have to resort to fictions. In this lecture, I intend to expound David Armstrong's combinatorial fictionalist theory of possibilities, and more interesting, discuss some problems which modify the theory, and also show how it provides us with a theory of concepts, because I think we need a theory of objective concepts as well as objective possibilities. Okay, so we start with the exposition. He has an ontology of states of affairs of the form PA if P is a monadic property, RAB if R is a dyadic relation, etc. There may be other things you could have in place of states of affairs, and we'll discuss that in a seminar. But states of affairs will do. Now, I call a sum, a mereological sum of states of affairs, a system, bearing in mind that mostly when we talk of systems, we mean systems in which the component particulars are connected by relations or chains of relations. So if they're not connected, it's degenerate. And this ties in with a known issue in mereology, the issue of whether things that are unrelated or are not related in salient ways do form a sum. If anyone's interested in that, I could argue why I think they do. I won't add anything to David Lewis's argument in that respect, but I could go through it. But let's just say that if you don't like calling things a system in which the parts are not connected, just two distinct states of affairs, this cup being on this table and Paris being in France, think of it as a degenerate system, if you like. Okay, I'm just going to call such things systems because I want a word for sums of states of affairs. If you like, you can follow David Armstrong's terminology and call them molecular states of affairs. But I think that's a bit misleading. No. Anyway, initially Armstrong supposes that we have a bundle of, not a bundle, we have a collection of simple particulars in various states of affairs. So you've got just the particulars and you've got the properties and relations. A simple particular is one without proper parts. But in this context, the subtle distinction between simples and atoms need not worry us particularly. What he has in mind, and what I would have in mind, are spatiotemporal points. People sometimes say that Armstrong didn't believe in bare particulars, but for him a point in space-time is very like a bare particular. Scholars tell me that Thomas Aquinas said something about space being signed matter, and the scholars tell me this is a very similar view. I don't understand Aquinas. Presumably Aquinas understood Aquinas, I don't know. Anyway, so I modified Armstrong's theory by including particulars that are themselves systems. And let me say why I think he thought this, because I think he was thinking that in a combinatorial theory you build things up from their elements. Well, you don't really have to, because what he does is he borrows bits of the actual world and tries to build up from the bits of the actual world possible things. That's where the combination occurs. But you don't have to take the bits of the actual world and analyze them into their components and then put those components together to get the possible world. You can simply take the bits of the actual world and rearrange them without analyzing them. So I don't actually think he needed ever to simplify matters in that regard. And then he goes to a lot of trouble in his book. It's quite a slim book, it's worth reading. In his book on the topic to say, oh, well, we can talk about relative atoms and things. I don't think that's necessary. Tell me if you think it is. Now here's my example. This is how I really think things should be. Well, either this or something better I can't think of. The geometry of space-time is described just using three antisymmetric transitive dyadic predicates, proper part, temporally prior, of less volume. And the whole of physics supervenes on geometry. In that case, the actual world is just the sum of states of affairs of the form B's being a proper part of, D's being prior to E, and F's being less than G. Or so Armstrong would say if he'd granted me this. I'm sure, you know, he would have liked to have, except he was less presumptuous than I am about second-guessing the theory of everything. He would express some humility on that subject. Humility is an overrated virtue. Genuine humility is all right if you've got moral failings and so on. Apart from that. So Armstrong would say call these sums molecular facts. I would add, of course, if you want to describe the universe, you need all the supervening states of affairs, everything that emerges as well. So an example of a supervening state of affairs is something being a bisimple. That is, it being the sum, the mereological sum of two disjoint parts that themselves have no proper parts. You can see how, and this is quasi-mathematical, of course, because these sort of chains of definitions are what mathematicians really deal with. It's what's characteristic of mathematics, the ability to deal with long chains of, nested chains of definitions. But it's a little bit of fairly simple mathematics, this mereology. You can characterize now something being a bisimple. Seems quite a natural thing, but it supervenes on the other statement. Okay, so on Armstrong's theory then, a possible world is a system, in my sense, a sum of real or fictional states of affairs. And that's where his theory is interesting, because he considers the fictional states of affairs. Very interesting in terms of, I think, intellectual biography, because one of the things that drove Armstrong and actually drove the philosophy department of which he was part, there was a split, there were two philosophy departments, and there was a big civil war, there was a split, and drove was the total rejection of subjectivist social construction, anything that struck them as being sort of wishy-washy. And that's one of the things that attracted me to that department. The intellectual equivalent of brutalism in architecture. Okay, so we have an example. But so therefore it's significant that he actually posited some fictions, because that sounds a bit sort of soft and wishy-washy. An example of a fictional state of affairs is bees being blue, where B is a gorilla. Actually, gorillas deserve real names. So Sally being blue, where Sally is a gorilla. So we've got a real gorilla, Sally, and we've got a real property being blue. And now we can think of a fictional system, the sum of Sally's being blue and Sally's being a gorilla. And that's a fiction. There isn't a mountain valley somewhere with a happy group of blue gorillas. The world is a wonderful place, but not in that particular way. Because he permits some fictions, he can extend his theory simply saying the blue gorilla system is a fictional state of affairs. not just the sum of two states of affairs. He could say it was a fictional state of affairs instantiating a fictional universal, being a blue gorilla. We can't ask him, sadly. Anyway, it's not a big deal. And then we can abstract, I say, real universals from fictional systems. And this is one of the things I disagree with Armstrong about. We've got these fictional properties. We can, I say, instead of saying, as Armstrong would have, that being a blue gorilla is a fictional universal. I mean, he didn't say that, but I'm saying that's what he could have said. I would say, no, why shouldn't we say being a blue gorilla is a real, non-fictional universal? Because Armstrong believed that every universal had to have an instance, but I've never really understood why people say that. And the reason I don't really understand it is, if you think of universals as respects of resemblance, there are non-fictional respects of resemblance among fictional things. If I say of one of my least favoured politicians, in fact my local member, he resembles a beetroot, and if I say of another politician in the same party, he resembles a potato, those are fictional resemblances, right? They're not really like beetroots and potatoes. The potato is just a right-wing bastard and the beetroot is possessed by the devil. But they're not really like potatoes and beetroots. So that's a fictional resemblance. But if I say, I used this example before, but of a sad acquaintance of mine, she resembles Anna Karenina in her love affair, that would be a real respect of resemblance involving a fictional character. If a somewhat poor student of literature thought that Anna Karenina resembled a character from people used to read these things. The English publisher was Mills and Boon. Just completely trashy romances. I mean, I don't know whether people have them anymore because we've moved on, but you know, bookstores and things, and you have these completely trashy romances with rather lurid colours. That would be a fictional respect of resemblance between fictions. So the point I want to make is that there can be real respects of resemblance involving fictional systems. And so I don't actually see why you can't have uninstantiated universals. But let me just make, that's a modification I would make to his theory. He would say being a blue gorilla would be a fictional universal, there's no such thing. And I would say, no, it's a real universal, but its instance is a fictional state of affairs. But the basic idea is that you recombine real elements of the world. Now, you could also, in Armstrong's system, introduce other particulars, fictional particulars. So so I've talked about the state of affairs that Sally is a blue gorilla, but now I could actually say, someone could say, well, which gorilla is Sally? Where does Sally live? And I say, oh, I don't know, in a upper mountain somewhere in Africa. I mean, Sally's actually a fiction. So, and Armstrong would allow that because he allows, as intuitively obvious, I think he would say, that there could be more things than there actually are. Well, perhaps it isn't intuitively obvious, but what's obvious is if in fact you think there are a fairly small, no more than a fairly small infinity of things, you come up with some number, you know, whatever it might be, 2 to the power aleph null or something, then Armstrong would allow that it's possible there could be more things. Okay, now the notable feature of his ontology, another thing I think is just unnecessary, and which we touched on quite a lot yesterday, is Armstrong posits a relation of totaling between a particular x and the property being an x. If x is the mereological sum of all the, oh sorry, that's terrible, a particular x and the property u, if x is the sum of the u's and there's no u disjoint from the x, then there's a totaling relation between x and u. So, the mereological sum of all the gorillas, regrettably not that many of them, and the property or the kind being a gorilla are related by a totaling relation. The sum, the mereological sum of all the gorillas, totals being a gorilla. Now, Armstrong thinks he needs this to provide truth makers for negative truths. Thus, the truth there are no blue gorillas is made true, according to Armstrong, by the sum of all gorillas, the states of affairs, that each gorilla is on the brown-black spectrum, each actual gorilla is on the brown-black spectrum. There may be a few albinos, but don't quibble. And the totaling relation between the sum of all gorillas and the property of being, or the kind, being a gorilla. For this to work, Armstrong probably needs to find a truth maker somewhere for the generalization that nothing blue is on the brown-black spectrum. I know what Armstrong said about that. What he said was, and this is a bit like Javier's theory, we go to science to provide that truth maker. The reason why nothing blue is on the brown-black spectrum is not some wonderful a priori truth about colors. It's because you look what reflectances constitute the brown-black spectrum, and you look what reflectances constitute blue, and the reflectances differ. Then you get the problem, why can't something have two different reflectances? Well, that's a problem we're coming to, but you at least go back to the scientifics on that. There's a tension in Armstrong's respect to resemblance theory, I think, because if universals are taken to be respects of resemblance, then negative concepts do not, for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, correspond to universals. And totalizing has a negative component. We should judge, therefore, that totalizing is a concept, yes, but there isn't a genuine universal corresponding to it. And I suggest, as a friendly amendment to Armstrong's theory, that those concepts are not real, that are not real universals, are fictional ones. So, I think, as I said, I think introducing totalizing is contrary to the spirit of a sparse realism in which universals always correspond to respects of resemblance. Because I don't think totalizing situations really resemble each other. Anyway, I may be wrong about that. Maybe you think we do need totalizing. Anyway, if so, we need to say just which possible systems count as possible worlds. I think we need that. It's a little tricky, but when we say there are things that are merely possible, that's sort of intuitively obvious, unless you say you mean they exist, in which case it becomes highly problematic. But if you're talking about fictions, it doesn't seem a problem. Are we to say there are even fictionally such things as possible worlds? Well, it's not so obvious, but still, it helps in the theory, the things we use possible worlds for in semantics, to have possible worlds, not just possibilities. I mean, if you think that David Lewis's theory of counterfactuals is correct, and I have some worries about it, but if you think it's correct, then you need to go to the nearest possible world in which something happens. So I just, at this stage, note there's a problem. Which possible systems count as worlds, just parts of worlds? Just flag that problem. Well, we'll come to a solution. What makes it true at various worlds that there are no blue gorillas is not a totaling fact, but the failure of that world to contain blue gorillas, I say. Okay? Why do we need the totalizing? You've got a world, you've got to say what counts as a world, but if you can say what counts as a world, you don't need a special totaling relation between that world and the kind, or the, say the kind flying pig or something. There's no possible, well, maybe they're possible worlds. There's no actual world containing flying pigs. They're possible worlds. Okay, so some worlds they're flying pigs, other worlds there are no flying pigs. I don't see the need for a totaling relation between the sum of all pigs and whatever ensures they're not flying, to show that in the world there's quite a truth maker, for in the world there are no flying pigs. We just need to say it. Of the world, there are no flying pigs. As we discussed yesterday, even if you do have totaling relations, I think you're still going to have to be able to say in your ideology, in your conceptual scheme, or whatever you want to call it, your basic language, talk about things and say they know this, they know that. So you would say, for example, of your scheme, if you believed in a totaling relation, there's only one totaling relation. We don't have different totaling relations for different kinds of things. If that's true in your theory, you'd have to say it. And I don't see how positing totaling helps you with that problem. Okay, another point of divergence with Armstrong. He seems to agree with me, implicitly at least, that fictions are grounded in non-fictions, but restricts his attention to fictions that are sums of instances of real universals. I want to allow other kinds of groundings of fictions. Fictions may be instances of fictitious universals, I say, provided these themselves are grounded in reality. And so you might have the case, again, let's just use the baby example I used before, of Hume blue, the supposedly missing shade of blue. You can have a fictitious Hume blue object. Now, Hume blue is a real universal, sorry. Okay. Now we've got the fiction of a different kind of color range. Okay, so you might have in a story, in fact, as a story by C.S. Lewis just like that, one in which, in some alien situation, the sky is a color, but it's of no color we human beings know of. Now, that would be a fictitious universal, this color in whatever you call the planet Venus, I can't remember. But we'll make it a possible world, not an actual world, so it doesn't matter. In this possible world, well, it's a fiction by C.S. Lewis. In this possible world, the sky is a color which is not one of our colors. It doesn't mean it's Hume blue. It's not as if the sky, you know, on Earth is never this particular wonderful shade, but it is there. That's not what we're saying. Hume blue, the missing shade, is a genuine universal, I say. But no, it would be a fictitious instance of a fictitious universal, but that fictitious universal would be grounded in a real universal to do with colours. It would be a fictitious determinate of the non-fictional determinable colour, as opposed to Hume blue, which I say is a non-fictional determinate of this determinable, but is one which, we're supposing, has no instance, which is different. Now I shall, in the next chapter, this isn't a book. In the next lecture, I shall use Frege abstraction, as I call it, as a way of grounding the determinants of a determinable. In addition, we have supervenient universals, non-trivially supervenient universals, and non-trivial supervenient concepts. What we do there is fairly straightforward. We don't need the supervenient universals to construct isn't the right word, but to specify the possible worlds. But once we've got them, we find, oh, there are lots of other universals there. That's what it means for them to be supervenient. If we are, I'll use the word construct, but it's not quite right. If we're constructing these fictional worlds using bits and pieces of the actual world, then we've got our actual world and we've got the fictional worlds and things, and now we can note that there are extra properties which we didn't sort of build into the system. They're just there because of what we did build into the system, and they're supervenient, or perhaps it might better say they're emergent, but they're emergent in a way that may be entirely explicable. Okay, so that's the modified theory of combinatorial theory of possibility. So what should I say about structural universals? On one of the theories I rejected, which I used to hold, which I've called the Stalnaker theory, possible worlds are complex universals. And I said unless we look at instances, we can't give an adequate theory of these structural universals. So among complex properties, the structural ones are the form being the sum of particulars with various designated properties and standing in various designated relations. That's typically what we mean by a system. So it's being a system of a certain type. So a structural property is a type of system. So being a cup of such and such a size inside a cup of such and such a size, okay, it's got the property of being of such and such a size, say that's 200 milliliters, inside a cup of say 300 milliliters. You've got the typical structure of a system, though of course they get more complicated. You've got some things with properties standing in various relations. So it's also got the property of relation of touching. It's not just inside there, a touch. And you know, it's not just of a certain volume, it's got transparency and opacity and so on. If opacity is a genuine property, I'm not sure about that. Okay, so I argued against the idea of explaining structural properties algebraically, or building them up in a combinatorial way. The alternative, which I take to be Armstrong's, is that structural properties are abstracted. This is Armstrong in response to David Lewis's complaint in a paper in 1986 or something thereabouts, you know, years ago, when I was almost young, that you can't build up complex properties because mereology is not powerful enough to do so. His answer is you just abstract them from complex structural particulars. And I think that's correct. You don't have to, strictly speaking, you don't build up these complex properties. You can later analyze them, because I've got nothing against describing things algebraically, but I'm just saying it's not constitutive or explanatory, that's all. They're abstracted from complex structural properties. So if we follow Armstrong in this respect, we should treat all our universals as abstractions from particulars, such as states of affairs, which is not compatible with literally thinking of them as constituents. Well, I don't think it is. I don't think we can say on the one hand a universal is respect of resemblance, abstracted from things, and on the other hand, universals make these things up. If you think we can combine the two, I'd be very interested. I'd like to. I don't think we can do it. So that bears on the way that merely possible states of affairs, which are fictions, are constructed. If universals are abstractions from states of affairs, then those same universals should not be used to construct the states of affairs in question, which would be circular. That doesn't imply, however, that all properties have instances, because a fictional state of affairs can be constructed from instantiated universals, and then we can abstract other complex universals from the fictional states of affairs. So I'm not denying that states of affairs can be constructed from universals if they're fictional ones. I'm simply saying that universals aren't constructed, or non-fictional universals aren't constructed from non-fictional universals. So we can give some geometric examples. The property of being connected with finitely many parts, which can only occur if space is discrete, is abstracted from a fictitious discrete system if in fact space is not discrete. A system that would be allowed by David Armstrong, a system in which points are related by adjacency. In a discrete space, you can have adjacent points. In a continuous space, you cannot have adjacent points, touching points, being next door to points, if you don't like the idea of them touching, next door to points. But Armstrong, with his fictionalism, would allow, because they're points, assuming there are points, and there's adjacency, you're allowed to talk about states of affairs of points being adjacent, which would be characteristic of a discrete space. So a discrete space would be possible if space is actually continuous, and vice versa. Okay, I've given some examples here I've already talked about. Now, concepts. That's a theory of, implicit in that, or no, it's explicit actually, is a theory of structural universals. They're not composed, not in general composed of other universals. We go via the particulars. So we construct fictional states of affairs, and then using the actual and fictional states of affairs, we abstract universals, which we can then say are structural because we know, because the structure is exemplified in the pattern of the particulars. We don't have to build up structure in the universals, we build it up in the states of affairs, real or fictional. And that gets around the difficulties that were met by people like Bieler and Zalter and myself at one stage in trying to give some kind of algebraic or combinatorial account of the structure of universals. Now we have concepts. Okay, consider again X, something being the sum of H2O molecules and something being a portion of water. Following Kripke, these are different concepts but the same universal. The puzzle is resolved by taking the concepts to be higher order universals. Okay? Thus one concept is being the universal related to the universal H2O by being the sum of its instances. That's a complex universal, but it's a complex relation between two universals. One concept which is being water. No, well, it's just being the sum of H2O molecules. Okay, that's. But we're not talking about the thing that is the sum of H2O molecules. We're talking about the property a universal has if it stands to the universal H2O by the relation. Sorry about that. Should get rid of that. Being the sum of some instances. Okay. The other property is being a water kind. No doubt that supervenes on various properties such as the temperature at which it is liquid, its optical properties and so on. But that's something which the early stages of science, perhaps even Aristotelian science or pre-Aristotelian or science 100,000 years ago, but the early stages of investigating the kinds of things reveals what it is to be water, not in the sense of being H2O, but something that is liquid at certain temperatures, is transparent, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now we can consider as instances not merely the actual one, but fictional instances resulting in fictional, impossible worlds in which these fictitious universals have distinct instances. So we're looking at the universal being a water kind. It doesn't exclude there being several universals that are water kinds. This ties in with a discussion we were having yesterday about Ramseyan humility. Carol's discussion about Ramseyan humility. Because Ramseyan humility suggests that we don't, if you were humble too soon, as it were, before you got to your final theory, if you were actually medieval would have been Ramseyanly humble in this way. They would have said, look, we know what a water kind is, that sort of universal, but we don't know the true nature of water. We know better, we do know the true nature of water. But if you had been humble in the Ramseyan way back then, you would have excluded the mad hypothesis of there being several different universals that are being a water kind. Note though, that's not mad in other contexts, that's just multiple realization. But still, it's a bit zany when he comes to thinking about water. So, water kind could have been multiply realized. So we have fictitious universals, and we have fictitious universals that instantiate being the sum of some instances of water. H2O, I mean, sorry. Being the sum of some instances of H2O. So there are fictional impossible worlds in which these fictitious universals have distinct instances. Worlds in which it's not the case that the same universal instantiates being a water kind and instantiates being related to H2O as the sum of instances. Those are worlds in which water is not H2O. They are instances of concepts that are possible universals. I say. They're not actual universals. And so in this case, the conceivable situation that water is not H2O is possibly possible, even though it's not possible. There are, I hold, higher order concepts, notably in mathematics, because as I said, what mathematicians do, which typically logicians don't do, is work with nested sequences of definitions, which if you were to unpack them all, would be unsurveyably complicated. And corresponding to those nested definitions, you get fairly rarefied concepts of what is possibly, possible, etc. Maybe you think it stops. Maybe you think it doesn't work. But anyway, I call that the diamonds forever theory of conceivability. The theory that to be conceivable is to be either actual or possibly possible, or possibly possible, etc. You can have cases where a concept has no instance at all. So the example given was previously of water not being H2O. Well, that was a case where various fictional universals were distinct, where we would take them to coincide, but a concept that has no instance at all, for example, is being a portion of CO2 that is also water. It's still a possible universal. No, it's a, yeah, I think it's still a possible universal, not an actual universal. I should mention another kind of fiction. I don't think we get all fictions this way, unfortunately. Consider a relational concept which might or not be a real universal. And for ease of exposition, concentrate on the dyadic case. So we have R, X, Y. There's the proposition that R, A, B, where A and B are some particulars. But we may also consider the concept R, X, B standing in R to B. For instance, being within 1 billion kilometers from the sun. Such concepts have been called impure universals. I'll call them relative concepts, not to be confused with relational ones, such as being within 1 billion kilometers from a star. Relative concepts do not generate any possibilities additional to the underlying relation. But in those cases in which they are genuine concepts, they might be counterexamples to the thesis that every concept is either an instance of, or an instance of an instance of, etc., a real universal. They're grounded in universals, but in a different way. I'll discuss that in the next lecture. These are actually quite important, these impure universals, or what I call relative concepts, because even though they are fictions, they do give us a solution to the instantiation problem that I was saying was so difficult before. It's a bit of a problem because I don't want to say they're genuine universals. I think they're just fictional ones, but that's why I'm not happy with this solution. The solution is fairly straightforward if you allow them. I mean, suppose you just thought there really were these impure universals. Then you've got a solution to the instantiation problem, and it's a fairly easy one. You've only got a single instantiation predicate. And, okay, you say, someone says, but what about the, I object, the Coca-Cola cup being between the two transparent cups? What's the instantiation of betweenness? Well, it works like this. There's a relation of betweenness. Having the Coca-Cola cup between is now an impure dyadic relation. Okay, having the Coca-Cola cup between is now an impure dyadic relation. that's instantiated by the one and only instantiation relation with taking as its instance the one with some water in. And so now having a Coca-Cola cup between it and a cup full of water is now an impure monadic property. And now I instantiate it once again with this thing, and I've now got my instantiation. So I can instantiate repeatedly, starting off with the relation, I can instantiate repeatedly, one at a time, one place at a time. Always the first place, there's an order to this. It's always what we represent as the first place. So there's only one instantiation predicate. And this way, we don't need this complex predicate, which I don't like, being x, y, z, etc., instantiating in that order universal U. Great solution to the problem, but remember the consequence of that is your account of the instantiation of a non-fictional universal, like being between, involves the instantiation of fictional universals, so-called impure universals, which I call relative concepts, obtained by putting the Coca-Cola cup, instantiating it. I seek advice on that, whether you think that's a genuine solution or not. Okay, what are we to say of supervenient properties? I've already talked about supervenient properties, but let me note that many universals are analysed in terms of negation. This is a sparse theory, respects of resemblance. We can't automatically take negations. There's no property of not being a black raven. But there are some properties for which our analysis involves a negation. Being a spherical shell is presumably a universal. Okay, and if that's the sort of example Plato would have liked, here's the sort of example that Aristotle would have liked. The kind fish, which consists of vertebrates that are not tetrapods, and this paraphyletic kinds, as they're called, occur again and again and again. Whatever reasons we have for realism about properties and relations, these reasons hold for such complex universals. There's nothing wrong with them. I say, because they involve a negation, we treat them as supervenient. So we say that something being a spherical shell supervenes on the instances of more fundamental universals. We have to accommodate supervenient universals in any case, because of examples such as the supervenience of colours on wavelengths of light, or more controversially, sensation on brain activity. I actually think there's a more complicated story in that case. But so we might as well assimilate all structural properties to cases of supervenience. Supervenience is easily understood in terms of respects of resemblance. The systems are characterized in terms of basic properties and relations, and then we discern that various systems resemble in some respects. Are there enough possibilities? I don't know why I said that. Something's gone wrong here. Okay, yeah, I now see what the problem is, yeah. So the idea is that the complex universals, if they're supervenient, are abstracted from sums of actual states of affairs, if they're instantiated, but you can allow the possible states of affairs as well. But the possible states of affairs then are constructed out of the instantiated universals. And now we get some extra uninstantiated universals abstracted from merely possible sums of states of affairs. They can be used to generate further fictional states of affairs, and so on. Do we get everything that's possible in this way? Are there plausible counterexamples, namely uninstantiated determinates of an instantiated determinable that cannot be derived in this way? Well, I say here, and I don't think I want to prove it at this very moment, that a field on a four-dimensional space-time like ours that takes values on a seven-dimensional sphere might provide examples. But a straightforward vector field is amenable to a variant on Armstrong's analysis. So we can get possibilities like a vector field on space-time because we can consider the sum of finitely or infinitely many fictitious objects exerting various forces, the same as those exerted by some actual objects. That fictional thing will then exert a force that depends on the arrangement of the fictitious objects, and that will give us any force we like, even one that isn't actually instantiated. But I have an alternative, and the alternative will include the fancy case of a field in some exotic mathematical object where there are no actual fields in this exotic mathematical object. How do we show these are possible on Armstrong's theory? We don't seem to have enough bits to compose them. Well, at this point I'm going to rely again on fundamental nominalism. Recall that when we've got these states of affairs, the properties supervene on those. You don't have to build the supervenient properties into the states of affairs. You just find them there. That's what it is for them to supervene. So if you think of yourself constructing the states of affairs, you construct the states of affairs and then imagining surprise. Surprise, there are all these other properties there. Right. They're supervenient. But the possible states of affairs don't actually need universals at all. If we adopt fundamental nominalism, we can actually short-circuit, jettison, get rid of the whole Armstrongian theory, because possible states of affairs are described in terms of the fundamental predicates. So you can actually give a purely nominalist account of possible worlds if you use fundamental nominalism. So various universals then occurs genuine respects of resemblance. This is, I said, nominalism only at the fundamental level. So what I want to say is this, that in response to the problem of how we get enough possibilities, whether there aren't things that are intuitively possible that we can't construct Armstrong style, I want to say that all the universals supervene on the possible states of affairs, and that possible states of affairs can be described in terms of fundamental predicates. How can we do that? Well, it's just given in the language. I mean, it's a purely nominalist. It's at the fundamental level. It's just like Carnap. At the fundamental level, you know, you've just got all the different every proposition in Quinese is a possible state of affairs. If you allow infinite sums of these possible states of affairs. You've got fictional states of affairs described as infinite sums of propositions in Chinese. Does that work? Well, that way of simplifying a combinatorial theory of possibility was proposed in response to the problem that we don't get enough possibilities simply taking actual universals and rearranging them in various ways. But it itself may have the following difficulty. By taking mereological sums of states of affairs that just correspond to propositions in Chinese, we allow for infinite disjunctions, but we might also want infinite conjunctions. But we can get those because we've got the negation of the infinite disjunction of the negations, because we've got negation in Chinese. Now, you might still think this is a drastic oversimplification, but once we grant that some universals are going to supervene on others, and you've just got to look at the possible worlds and say, oh wow, these things resemble in some respect, I would never have thought it, as it were, but there they are, they resemble in some respect, then why not get rid of the universals completely from your theory of possibility? Okay, so that's a suggestion I'm making, that we don't really need Armstrong's theory at all. This is in the spirit of Armstrong's theory. We have these possible states of affairs. We don't need to use universals to generate them. We can just generate them using Chinese, using our basic language. Okay, now this is the big problem. Compossibility. There's the danger of generating fictitious states of affairs that are not possible, simply by recombining actual ones. Consider the state of affairs that something is both CO2 and water. Now, Armstrong is aware of this problem. He doesn't take the easy way out, which is to rely on the truths about universals to specify just which of the states are possible. I take it this is because the universals are being assumed to depend on their instances, something which I'm assuming in a different way. I'm assuming that universals supervene on the world of particulars, not they depend on them. It's not explanatory dependence, but it supervenes. In that case, the Kripkean explanation of necessity in terms of identity of universals and so on isn't an ultimate explanation. It's one of those explanations we get, like explaining why the square peg doesn't fit into the round hole, where we don't go back to the physics and chemistry of holes and hole surrounds, we just use the geometry. It's not in a way the ultimate explanation, but it's the best explanation because it is perspicuous. Now, Armstrong's theory here is problematic because the impossibility that water is CO2 is derived from the necessity that water is H2O and the non-identity of carbon with H4. So it seems that somehow we are relying on the Kripkean type explanation of necessity, but as I said, the important thing here, I think, to get around that is to say that you can have different compatible explanations. You can have explanations that are perspicuous and explain things in terms of that we can understand, or you have in principle explanations that go back to basics that are unsurveyable. But let's take basic relations. That's where the problem really occurs then. Armstrong discusses the relation of temporal priority. Okay, now, it's a necessary truth, I say, that if x is before y, y is not before x. Armstrong denies that. Now, why does he deny that? He denies that because on his combinatorial theory, there's nothing to, you will get fictional states of affairs of one thing being before another and vice versa. Let's take a concrete example. Let's suppose our universe began with a Big Bang. It began with the Big Bang, which I will call B. And it will end, let us suppose, with a final crunch, which I will call C. Now, there's a well-known theory in which there will be a new Big Bang after the final crunch. But I'm considering now the supposition the final crunch is the very same event as the Big Bang. So time is circular. Now, that's something I say is impossible. It's something Armstrong says is possible, and it's possible because I've just described it, basically. I've just followed the Armstrong procedure of taking elements of the actual world and recombining them to get a state of affairs. So it must be possible according to Armstrong. But I say it's impossible. And I have intuition on my side. Okay, so how does Armstrong argue against this? Well, argue that this is indeed possible. Well, he thinks circular time might be possible, as an example I've given. And he suggests that, but it's just, so now consider transitivity, just thinks that's a good example. You know, okay, sure, that's fine, that example, okay. Now he considers that transitivity might not hold for a basic relation of direct priority. So that, and what we call priority is the ancestral of direct priority. So what he allows is this. He allows that nothing is prior to itself. So if we have circular time, it seems by the transitivity of priority, the Big Bang would be prior to itself, which he thinks is absurd. But he denies the transitivity of temporal priority because he says that, well, he doesn't deny the transitivity of temporal priority. What he says is, what's absurd is something being directly prior to itself, but we can consider the ancestral. X is directly prior to Y, Y is directly prior to Z, etc. And so he says that, of course it doesn't follow from that that X is directly prior to Z. Direct priority, you know, immediately prior to, isn't transitive. So what he replaces is the intuition that nothing is prior to itself, which seems a strong intuition, he grants that, but he says, no, what we really mean is nothing is directly prior to itself. And he then motivates this by analogy with causation. Well, the first objection to this is the postulation of direct priority is ad hoc. Direct causation isn't an ad hoc idea, but direct priority is. Why? Because in the specious present, we are immediately aware of some events being before others, even though these events before others of which we are directly aware are separated by far more than any minimum separation there could be between moments of time. If there's such a relation as direct priority, presumably there's a minimum distance for direct priority. We can easily think of examples from physics in which we don't have direct causation over a very short span of time, so direct priority would have to be restricted to an extremely small span of time, say the Planck time or something, and we are well aware of some things being prior to others in our immediate given of the specious present, what we're immediately aware of, which is separated in time by far more than the minimum amount which would be that of direct priority. So we don't have, so saying something being directly prior is not the same as saying it's immediately adjacent. So if things can be separated by, say, 1/10 of a second, and one being after the other, what independent motivation is there for denying that x can be directly prior to y, even if it's separated by an arbitrarily great stretch of time? And the other objection is that even if circular time was used to provide a counterexample to the antisymmetry of temporal priority, we would fall back to another intuition, namely that direct priority is antisymmetric. If we're going to have this idea of direct priority, we have the idea that direct priority is antisymmetric. Circular time is not a counterexample to that intuition, and that necessity, that direct priority is antisymmetric, would still be something that is excluded on Armstrong's theory. And that is joined or supported by the analogy between time and causation. So Armstrong then faces this problem of that what he actually generates with his recombination seem to me to be far more like things that are conceivable than things that are possible. It's conceivable that the Big Bang is the very same event as the final crunch, but I say we should accept our intuition and say it's impossible. Time cannot be circular. How do we solve that problem? Well, once again, I think I'm forced to accept fundamental nominalism. The basic underived, those universals that don't have structure as universals, those universals that are simple, correspond to primitive predicates in Quinese in the ideology. The logical characteristics of the primitive predicates in the ideology, such as transitive and irreflexivity, can simply be built in. Then, of course, we've got to explain how it's conceivable they're not irreflexive, but that can be done, I think. Fundamental nominalism also solves the problem of deciding which systems count as possible worlds. If we're to avoid totaling, we may describe complete spatio-temporal universes using the predicates of the ideology. In the ideology, in Quinese, we can talk about negation. So we can say which spatio-temporal universals are complete. The description will be rather meagre, lacking the supervenient properties, but it suffices to specify which systems are worlds. So the although I think you can defend a great deal of David Armstrong's theory, in the end I want to modify it to produce a fundamentally nominalist combinatorial theory of possibility. Let's summarize what I've got. Fundamental nominalism. There's a complete description of all that there is using the calculus of predicates and a few predicates that belong to the ideology in Quine's whimsical sense of that word. At the base level, we don't need very many predicates. That's what I'm assuming. An important question in metaphysics concerns just what these predicates are. Quine's use of the word ideology suggests that it's somehow subjective or anthropocentric, but I don't agree. I would offer an ambitiously reductive but non-naturalistic, indeed theistic metaphysics, in which we've got identity and some transitive antisymmetric predicates. X is a proper part of, X extends later than, X is less valuable than. We might need X is smaller than, X is conscious of Y. but there's going to be a short list of dyadic predicates. These predicates suffice to describe not merely every obtaining state of affairs, every actual thing, but every possible state of affairs. We don't need universals to describe the possible states of affairs given fundamental nominalism. On them supervene and, well, I don't know whether they depend actually, on them supervene objective respects of resemblance. There is, if you like to say, emergent naturalness. There are respects of resemblance which are universals. Some of these universals correspond to the predicates in the Quinian ontology. Some of them, in the Quinian ideology, I mean, some of them correspond to the basic predicates, some of them correspond to very complex predicates, but some of them don't correspond to predicates that can be finitely stated in the Quinian ontology at all. I'm assuming the language we're using doesn't have infinite operations, Quinese. The states of affairs are not the same as tropes in D.C. Williams' sense because they're unstructured. Tropes are unstructured. Higher order universals supervene on lower order ones. These are various combinations. We look at the universals themselves that we've got as, and we detect respects of resemblance among them. And so it goes up the order of universals. In this way, we abstract from the particulars to get the universals. We can then, if we like, use these higher order universals, and it's at this point that we need to resort to Armstrong's theory, because now we can get some conceivable but impossible states of affairs using the universals that we've abstracted from the states of affairs that we've described in Quinese. Here's something I've just thought of. I'm sorry about this. That works, that procedure. There's nothing wrong with that. So we start off with Quinese. We construct the possible states of affairs. We discover universals as respects of resemblance. We can then construct states of affairs in Armstrong's way using those universals. We won't get any new possible states of affairs, I don't think, that way. We'll just get the same ones. But now, if we look at the respects of resemblance between those universals, we can use Armstrong's procedure to construct not new states of affairs, because we're one order up, but new universals. And those universals will have instances. But I think they won't be possible states of affairs, the new ones. They'll be possibly possible. So they'll be conceivable. So I still need the Armstrong construction. That's why it's a modification of his theory, not a total abandonment of it. I'm relying heavily on this idea of fundamental nominalism, and I construct the possible worlds using fundamental nominalism, and the necessities that can't be understood otherwise are built into, are stated in Quinese. So they are, in effect, and there's an irony in this, of course, analytic truths in Quinese. It sort of goes back to Carnap in a way. Analytic truths stated in Quinese, which is ironic, of course. Because the meaning of the predicates in Quinese, I mean, in the ideology, not the complex ones, the meaning of the predicates in the ideology is not derived from, but is constrained by a small set of, or not sets, by few analytic truths in Quinese. These are constitutive of the meaning of the predicates in the ideology. And that we're forced to because on Armstrong's theory, he's forced to say things are possible, which I know are impossible. But I don't abandon Armstrong's theory because I need this procedure to get the impossible things, the concepts, because I get universals abstract from those, and I go down again, I'll get some impossible situations which are not constructs of Quinese, in Quinese, because every proposition in Quinese is a possibility. Okay, so that's my take on DMA's theory.